Or the land of the free and the home of the brave. O Canada, our home and native land. God save the King. These are some of the most recognizable lyrics of some of the most recognizable national anthems in the world. Whether the Star-Spangled Banner blares through the tenor of a horn at a baseball game, or God Save the King sounds as the King rides in front of Buckingham Palace, citizens know what it means. Stand up, remove your hats, and listen. Anthems have many meanings. Honor. Stand and bear witness for the soldiers who died for the country. Tradition. Ceremonial proceedings like inaugurations and coronations always require an anthem's melody to punctuate the importance of the event. Perhaps most importantly, though, anthems provide a sense of national pride. Even those most highly critical of a country still tend to revere the anthem. This national aspect of an anthem is critical for a great anthem. A great anthem requires national significance and should therefore instill desire and love for the listeners. The Star-Spangled Banner represents the U.S. prevailing over tyranny, a core symbol of our country's mythology. God Save the King references the historically significant English nobility and the thought that Great Britain would always prevail and the crown would always be sustained. These elements allow the listener to find their own meaning within these symbols. Any song can be honorific or respectful, but only a truly powerful anthem can instill these values for a whole nation. Much like the previous examples, the Japanese national anthem, the Kimigayo, evokes many of the same responses. It comes from a traditional poem that was later recomposed into song form, just like the Star-Spangled Banner. The Kimigayo's lyrics resemble the never-ending reign of the crown in the same way that the British national anthem does. However, its history has been marred with controversy regarding the practices surrounding it. How has this short, controversial poem become a symbol of nationalism and belonging in Japan, and how has that changed throughout history? The use and non-use of the Kimigayo directly reflects Japanese culture's willingness and want to emulate Western civilization. The anthem itself was written nearly 1,000 years ago during a period of Japanese history known as the Heian Age. The poem, in its traditional form, goes this: Kimigayo ha, chiyo ni yachiyo ni, sazare isho no, iwa to noride, koko no musumare, which roughly translates to, may your reign continue for 1,000, 8,000 generations, until the pebbles grow into boulders lush with moss. Despite its short length, the anthem has a very clear message. May you live on forever. The exact definition of you has become the subject of controversy. Some scholars believe that it initially was meant to represent a feudal lord. Others believed it signified a perfect marriage between a man and a woman. Eventually, however, the Kimi in the first line would shift to mean the shogunate, the emperor, and finally, Japan as a whole. However, the poem was never written with the intention of being the national anthem. In fact, for the majority of Japanese history, there was no national anthem. It wasn't until the start of the Meiji Restoration that a Japanese anthem came into existence. For some context, the Meiji Restoration started in 1868 as the final Japanese shogunate resigned from his position as the head of the government. Instead, powerful families held the majority of the control over the Meiji government, named after the mostly ceremonial figure Emperor Meiji. This period was known as a period of westernization and industrialization, trademarked by the slogan of the Great Leap Forward. Following centuries of isolationism, the Meiji period was the start of the emperor's westward diplomacy. Many Japanese diplomats went out to Western countries on foreign missions, such as the famous Iwakura mission. However, Western dignitaries also made efforts to go to Japan. In other cases, the Japanese would host small militias to dismiss intermittent violence that would occur throughout Japan. One such militia came with the British diplomat, the Duke of Edinburgh. During his stay, the bandmaster of the militia, John William Fenton, noticed something strange. Japan lacked a national anthem. Fenton, an Irishman, had been observing the Japanese military band in Yokohama in 1868 when he noticed the absence of the anthem. After further discussing it with the band, they connected him with an influential member of the Satsuma clan, one of the important families that ruled the Meiji government, Iwao Oyama, to create an anthem. Oyama was the one to suggest the Kimigayo as the lyrics for the anthem, and in 1868, Fenton composed the first Japanese anthem. The anthem was initially heavily criticized. The first main criticism were the non-traditional musical elements. Fenton's version had almost explicitly used a brass band, something that has not often been repeated and would have been difficult for the Japanese to reproduce. Prior to the Meiji Restoration, brass instruments were not often played in traditional Japanese music. The music of the time instead drew heavily from other Asian traditions. During the Heian Age, when the poem was written, much of the musical inspiration came from Chinese traditions. Choral singing and drum chants, similar to Buddhist traditions, were very common, as well as stringed instruments like the koto, which vaguely resembles the Indian sitar. The initial composition of the anthem was very non-traditional as well. A second criticism was the fact that the song was impossible to sing. How could a national anthem be a symbol of a country if it were completely inaccessible for the population? More importantly, if vocal music was such an important part of Japanese culture, how could such an impossible song truly reflect Japan? The final criticism was the song lacked solemnity. This point goes back to the idea of honor in anthems. The Star-Spangled Banner, for instance, discusses the bombing of Fort McHenry during the War of 1812, a solemn reference to the lives lost to protect the country. The musical choices of the song reflect this. The ritardando before the final lines of the song provide time for pause and reflection for the lives lost. The musical composition and the heavy brass instrumentalization lacks this sort of reflection in the Kimigayo. It is for these reasons that Fenton's Kimigayo did not last long. In 1880, Franz Eckert, while on a diplomatic mission, composed the final version of the harmony for the song, along with a traditional Japanese melody by Hayashi Hiramori. Eckert and Hiramori's Kimigayo also lacked many of the traditional elements of Japanese music. Eckert, a Prussian composer, musician, and conductor, had only ever had the classical experiences of listening to Western composers like Vivaldi, Bach, and Beethoven, prior to entering Japan. This meant that many Western wind and string instruments were favored in the harmonies. A koto is not necessarily a one-to-one replacement for a violin, and a shakuhachi does not have the same weight as an oboe. These aspects of the anthem act as a microcosm of Japanese culture as a whole during this time. Japan implemented the Gregorian calendar by 1873, drawing from Western empires over their traditional calendar. The Meiji Constitution, made into law in 1889, was modeled after the system of Franz Eckert's homeland, the German-Prussian Empire. In fact, the entire idea of a national anthem was brought over by Western people like John William Fenton. Much like the rest of the Meiji Restoration, the Japanese government and society were so willing to accept these new customs as a way to make themselves seem successful and modern through the lens of being modern. For citizens, the anthem provides a common symbol to rally behind, as was the case with many of the Meiji reforms. Because of the Kimigayo's Western elements, Japanese citizens internalized Japanese nationalism in being Western and emulating Western styles. Though the Constitution, the economy, and the calendar all represent this shift too, the Kimigayo, as a national symbol, was more accessible to the population and therefore a more ready example of the ways that Japanese nationalism and pride have been conflated with Western desire. From the late 1880s to the end of World War II, the Kimigayo was an important part of the Japanese Empire. It was taught in classrooms and played during official ceremonies, especially those that honored the emperor. This time period marked a period of Japanese history marked by imperial expansion, similar to the many powerful Western empires that Japan was so desperate to emulate. Japan had colonized Taiwan, the Philippines, and even part of China, including cities like Tianjin, where they had concessions with other imperial Western powers like Great Britain, Germany, and Russia. All of this represented the Japanese want to be more powerful, modern, and most importantly, Western. It is for this reason that the Kimigayo was most popular during this time, where the Japanese dogma reflected the elements of the Kimigayo, and the Kimigayo did the same and vice versa. However, at the end of the World War II, with the United States occupation of Japan, the Kimigayo fell into non-use. On the one hand, the United States often restricted the use of the Kimigayo as they attempted to eradicate any mentions of the emperor and the crown, which the Kimigayo explicitly references. During the time of Japanese history, there was a forceful removal of many of the Western ideas of the decades prior. For instance, the United States enforced an end to the militant efforts that had helped define Japan as Western and modern previously. Socially, the American government used their control over the media to influence the Japanese into supporting the hip new Western trend of democracy. The Japanese, with some outliers, were often receptive to these ideas. Unfortunately for Eckert and Hiramori, the Kimigayo did not reflect these new ideas. Despite the mantra of the emperor's reign living for 8,000 generations, the emperor was no more, and the Kimigayo lost much of the meaning it had had decades prior. After 1945, the Kimigayo no longer reflected the desire of westernization. Whereas in the 1800s, with the age of emperors and crowns, the Kimigayo and the use of an anthem fit perfectly with the idea of a Western Japan. Now, as the US occupied Japan, implementing their idea of modernization with a new constitution and way of life for the people, the anthem had become outdated and obsolete, to the point where it had been banned and alternatives had been brought up. In this case, to reflect the willingness of Japan to adhere to the terms of US occupation, Japan did away with the Kimigayo. Socially, as the Kimigayo no longer reflected the Japanese idea of being Western, the Kimigayo was not used as much as it has been, as a sense of nationalism it once had faded away. Throughout the latter half of the 20th century, Japan had been making steady strides in becoming an independent nation again. The economy was surging, and there was a revitalized sense of Japanese nationalism, demonstrated, for instance, during the 1964 Tokyo Olympics. There were also significant anti-American sentiments among the population, culminating in protests against Japan's support for the US in the Vietnam War. Japanese nationalism during this time was at an all-time high, seemingly in response to the US's occupation of Japan, giving all Japanese something to fight against. Still, the Kimigayo was not recodified into Japanese law, leading to some instances of cognitive dissonance within Japanese society. One such instance occurred in 1999, when a high school principal in Hiroshima committed suicide over mounting pressure regarding the Kimigayo. In other areas of the country, the Kimigayo was sung at graduation ceremonies and other formal events at rates of up to 80%. In Hiroshima, however, there was a public pushback and it was sung only about 12% of the time. In 1999, the Hiroshima Prefecture required its principals to play the Kimigayo at graduation ceremonies, leading to immense backlash, especially from minority communities. Part of the contention was with ethnically Japanese students who felt national pride represented by the Kimigayo, and minority students who had not been seen the same privileges from the culture and did not feel this sense of national pride. For many ethnically Japanese, the Kimigayo reflected the glory days of the empire, a time at this point that their grandparents and parents may speak fondly of their memories, a time when Japan was at its most powerful and its sole contention for the dominant Eastern superpower. For minority communities, however, that had been either colonized or discriminated against in Japan, the Kimigayo also represented this time, and specifically the negative aspects for them, and the negative aspects of an empire of hate. The formal discussion of where the Kimigayo should and should not be played is part of its storied history. What cannot be denied, however, that by playing or not playing it, there was making certain distinctions regarding Japanese nationalism. The Kimigayo, beyond the flag, beyond their emperor, beyond the government, was the symbol of Japan, and its debates during this time reflect this. Prior to his suicide, the government had not made any formalized restrictions or enforcements on the Kimigayo. However, following the death, the government now believed that the pressure put on school districts and principals to make the decision regarding the anthem was too much. In the wake of this tragic event, the government found it necessary to formalize the Kimigayo, and by extension the national flag, the Hinomaru, in order to mitigate the stress imparted on school districts. And ever since then, it has been the national anthem of Japan. It could have just as easily chose to let it be, or even restrict the use, and there were those that advocated for both of those options. But in wake of the re-nationalism of Japan, it made sense for the Japanese government to codify the national anthem, as more people felt a sense of pride using it. Beyond just this resurgence in nationalism, there was a resurgence of Japan on the international stage. During this time, there was an overall positive trend in the Japanese economy, mostly due to the great surge of technological and manufacturing industries. This made them a global superpower, on par with many of the Western countries that they had been trying to emulate over the course of its history. Finally, realizing their goals of being seen on par with the Western nations, the Kimigayo seemed to be the necessary option for the country. Japan has always had a troubled history with nationalism. Even from the earliest days of civilization and religion, Shinto beliefs suggest a strong bond between the Japanese, leading to hyper-nationalism in Japan, to the Empire of the East and extending to the modern day. Japan has been a nationalist country. No one symbol of Japanese mythology has better represented the shifts in Japanese nationalism in the modern age of westernization and modernization than the Kimigayo. As its place in Japanese history shifts back and forth, the Kimigayo reflects the trends of Japanese nationalism and, within that, Japan's goal of being considered Western and modern. For better or worse, the Kimigayo is the national anthem of Japan. Because of this, it holds a very specific meaning for the people who listen to it. There are, again, three crucial elements of a great national anthem: honor, tradition, and national pride. The Kimigayo is certainly honorific, but to whom? Like I said, the definition of Kimi, best translated as you, has dramatically shifted throughout the use of the anthem and the poem preceding it. On the topic of national pride, there's so much discussion and backlash about the proper use of the anthem that it's hard to say that it represents the entirety of the Japanese population, especially those previously subjugated by the empire. For tradition, you could argue that the use of the ancient poem is traditional, but that's not entirely fair. With the shift of the use of kimi, the different interpretations of the poem, and the very recent use of the anthem could not be considered traditional. So, to answer whom the honor is to, Western empires, Germany and Britain in the late 1800s, and the US from 1945 on, the anthem is a nod to the fact that Japan is as Western as they are, and a token of the respect that the government had to the westernization craze that Japan fell under socially and politically. It is nationalist in the same way that Japan nationally came to desire becoming Western. The Kimigayo is the anthem of Japan, but an anthem to the West.